us this morning, Professor David Mills as presenter, and then we have the discussant. Samuel is joining us from Codestra, I guess. Then we have everyone here. So before we start off, we want to just mention a few ground rules, I guess. Okay, so please, if you want to say, if you're not saying anything, we encourage you to put off your microphones. And then if you want to say something, please, you could signify by raising your hands. And of course, we hope it becomes an engaging discussion. The duration is just 1 hour. You will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussant for 10 minutes, and then we open the floor for Q&A. So, yes, I will like to introduce the presenter officially by reading his bio. Okay, so David Mills is Associate Professor in the Department of Education at the University of Oxford and Director for Global Higher Education. He's also Director of the African Books Collective. His research focuses on the political economy of the global science communication system and its impact on African knowledge future. His most recent book is Who Counts? Ghanaian Academic Publishing and Global Science, co-written with colleagues from the University of Ghana and Oxford. And this is available on open access from African Minds. He is also a guest editor of a recent issue of the Senegal-based journal, Global Africa, entitled Publishing Africa. And then, of course, more can be said and read about David Mills. So we welcome you. And then, of course, we also have our discussant who works with Codestra, Samuel. Samuel, I hope you are there.
I am here. Yes,
okay.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
good morning, colleagues.
Good morning. So we quickly we start off, and then the floor is yours, David.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you all online and in the room in UFS. I have lots of admiration for your team and the higher education and development community there. So it's a real honor to be presenting with you, and I hope this is going to be a good conversation. I hope I'm going to be speaking about something which we all care about, which we all worry about, and which we all sometimes don't understand, which is the role of academic publishing in our research careers and the importance of publishing and the challenges of publishing. I'm going to give you a bit of history. I'm going to give you some numbers and also make a critique of what I see as the consequences of a very commercial dominance of an academic publishing system. And look forward to all your thoughts and comments. I hope this can be a really inclusive conversation. So let me start, and I'm going to talk for 25 minutes, and I'm going to show you some slides. So it's called African Journals for African Knowledges, ? Building Visibility of the Continent's Research Ecosystems. Let me start with this picture. This is, if you don't know who it is, this is a man astride a very tall tower block in London, looking very pleased with himself, obviously. He looks rather Trumpian, I think. This is Robert Maxwell, probably in the 1970s. He imagined himself as a publishing colossus. He is a really interesting figure to understand quite how we are now in a world which is dominated by commercial publishers who publish academic journals for academics, because it wasn't always the case. Okay, obviously we can go back to the early history of academics writing letters to each other. The first journal was launched by the French and the English in the 17th century, and this was the journal was a sort of really correspondence between academics about their research. And at that point, this was one of the first journals was launched by the Royal Society. This was very much an academic owned and academic led process of sharing knowledge. So how is it that we've got to a situation now where 5 large commercial companies dominate academic publishing and own many of our journals and charge us a lot of money and make our libraries pay huge subscriptions? Well, I think a key role is being played by Robert Maxwell. This is a man who was born in the Czech Republic, in a poor part of the Czech Republic. He grew up seeing his father being a good trader, and he learnt some of those skills very quickly. He was ambitious and learnt many languages. During the Second World War, he joined the Czech resistance against the Nazis. He then joined the British Army and fought and won some medals. And after the war, he found himself in Berlin, where because of his skills, he was employed by the British to learn about and try and collect information on German science. He ended up becoming a bit of a double agent for the British and for the Russians, because everyone wanted German scientific knowledge. They wanted it because the language of science, really until then, was German. Chemistry was one of the first languages. Chemistry was one of the first global science fields. People had to learn German in order to study chemistry. And so there was an awful lot of academic publishing that was happening in Germany that he was well placed to get out into the world. And so he was the person who did the deal that managed to access some of the knowledge that had been kept behind by the Allies, and he sold it and set up a publisher in Britain called Pergamon Press. So he's shipping back annals and books and encyclopedias, and he starts very small in the early 1950s, launches a few journals under the press called Pergamon Press. He's very, very ambitious. He's worked out that actually there is a lot of money to be made by running an academic publishing business that is efficient, that moves fast, that attracts editors, and that looks after editors. And so quickly he expands. Okay, so what we're trying to understand here is the commercialization of academic publishing. At that point, perhaps before the Second World War, there were fewer commercial publishers. There were some, and obviously, Elsevier was an old publisher that had expanded in Germany and the Netherlands, but on the whole, publishing tended to be not that a dynamic or a sort of commercially focused field. Academic societies owned their own journals. Obviously, university presses did own journals as well. So he expands very fast. How does he do it? Well, he woos academics. He gets them to launch new journals. He invites them to posh parties. Here's a posh party in a tent in his house in Headington in Oxford, and he gives them nice flights, takes them nice places, and manages to win over many editors who want to launch new journals in new fields, or feel that there aren't enough spaces for their work. And in a massively expanding science system after the Second World War, he does very well because there's lots of more money for science, and therefore there's lots of people wanting to publish research. So very quickly he grows his journal collection, and by the 1990s, he's publishing 400 journals. Now, those of you who know the story of Robert Maxwell will know that he was also quite a sort of corrupt businessman, and eventually steals the money from the pension funds of the Mirror newspaper that he buys because he's running out of money, and so he has to sell the press in the end to Elsevier. But it's very profitable throughout his career and funds his many other business deals that go less well. Now, you need to know one other person here that is also important for what's happening after the war. This man is an information scientist. His name's Eugene Garfield. he's very worried about this massive expansion in the knowledge of the knowledge economy, you could call it, and the number of journals being published. And so he's worried about how librarians can possibly keep up with the huge number of growth of new journals. And so he comes up with a brilliantly clever idea of photocopying the abstracts pages of journals and stapling them together and then sending them to librarians so they can keep up with what's happening in their field and can tell their academics, well, these are the current papers. They can decide which journals to subscribe to. And of course, this particularly appeals to commercial research organizations, pharmaceutical research or chemical research, who may well be also quite influential in publishing science, but they also have more money perhaps than universities. So they definitely buy this product called current contents. So here we have somebody who's not publishing journals, but publishing lists of and collections of information about journals. And this is called current contents, expands very fast. Starts in life sciences and covers all the sciences. This is a very profitable business for him. And on the back of it, he comes up with a very ambitious idea of creating a science citation index. And this is the one, of course, we now know and love and hate. He launches it in the early 60s with a prototype. And the challenge he faces is that the computing facilities at that point are totally basic. How does he possibly create an index of all the citations? The idea is that he wants to be able to show scientists how knowledge unfolds and how one person's work builds on another person's work. So rather than an alphabetical index, this is an index to all the citations that a particular piece of work or a particular author has. And that's, of course, not what we know now, but at this point, it was all very difficult to do. He got lots of people, employed lots of secretaries to type in every reference in a selected number of journals into a huge database. And at that point, it was all very, very basic. And then to try and come up with these huge hardbound volumes. And even if you can see here, the first set were the 20 volumes of this citation index, even in the 1960s. Now, how many journals were in there and which journals were in there? Well, you can't do all the journals. I mean, it was an impossibility at that point to even think about scaling up. So he starts off by saying, right, well, look, let's choose the most important journals. And he decides that he can use a model of maths called the inverse power law, which is sort of pioneered by a mathematician called Bradford, where most of the articles that are most cited are in a limited number of journals. Okay, so the argument being is this: you don't need to index every journal. You just need to create an index of the most important journals. So he says, right, these are the most important journals. There are 1,000 of them in his first index. And as you can see from this list on the left, most of them are from the US and from the UK. 2/3 are from 2 countries. So immediately, right at the start of the 60s, he's defining a global playing field where there are no African journals. There are very few Russian journals. There are some German journals, but clearly most of the journals are the ones being published from the US and the UK, being published in English, because he's based in the US. These are the journals he knows because he's already photocopying them and sending them out to libraries. So I think you can see right at the start here that the way in which the knowledge field of global academy is shaped by this initial list. Because once you're in, of course, then you're in the index, everyone then starts citing you. And because you're more visible, because you can find the index and you can see where the knowledge is being cited. And so quickly publishers realize they want to get their journals into the index because that's how they will be made more visible. Now, of course, at this point, it's not been digitized. And so the number of journals in the index does gradually expand, and eventually some South African journals go in, and there are more journals from what you might call the Global South. But there are strong critiques right from the start of this skewed system. And in the 1990s, there's this brilliant piece in Scientific American just pointing out how few journals there are from across, at that point, what was called the Third World. The reason this all matters for now, for all of us, and the reason that this has become ever more important, is that in the 1990s, he sells the index and it gets digitized. And once it's digitized, then it's much more searchable and usable for people to work out who the most influential, who the most cited researchers are, who the most cited journals are. And then comes the launch of the World University Rankings. The first one was in 2003. Okay, that was by Shanghai Jiao Tong University and quickly followed by the Times Higher Education. So these citation indexes, he'd never made any money out of this. It cost him huge amounts, Eugene Garfield. It suddenly becomes incredibly profitable because it's used to inform the ranking of every university that participates in these rankings. So you can see here in the middle of this spread of all the points that go towards the ranking, 15% of the points go from citations, another 5% from research strength, another 5% from research productivity. So the volume and the quality and the citation impact all hugely affect the your final ranking. So that's why this citation index matters so much, and that's why it matters so much to be in it. And that's why, as a consequence of that, journals that aren't in it disappear. This is a slide just from the last 10 years to show how the publishing system keeps expanding. The commercial publishing companies, there's lots of reasons why open access and the move to an open access economy driven by APCs, article processing charges, makes it more profitable to publish more. And so you can see Elsevier has increased its publishing by 60% in the space of 10 years, and MDPI and Frontiers, of course, hugely increasing. So we've got a system here which is speeding up and which is increasingly caught up in an economics of what you might call outputs. And this is sort of my suggestion that actually, yes, there is a sort of an economy where the more the better. In terms of the publishing size of journals, the number of journals, the number of volumes, the number of issues. There's the rise of what you call mega journals, open access mega journals. I'm going to tell you more about those. They're interdisciplinary. They're very, very large. But we still, the whole thing is still built on, or there are these relationships between an output economy and a credibility economy. It still matters that the top journals are not expanding. They are high status. They're hard to get into. They control their reputation tightly. They have tight-knit editorial boards. They're often quite, incredibly hard to publish in. They'll often have a clear vision of an editorial vision. But all of that means, therefore, that on the one hand, you have this elite set of journals that are hard to get into, and then you have these much more inclusive journals. And then there's a third economy, which you might want to call the data economy, which is the data from these articles, what you call the metadata, the names and everything else associated with the article is equally valuable for these publishers. So you can see a way in which these three are all entangled and connected together. And one of our jobs as researchers is to understand quite how this works and why a publisher like, say, Taylor and Francis has these journals in, say, African studies that are elite and very sort of hard to get into, and it also has journals which are very much more inclusive. And you can also see why what I call bibliometric coloniality continues, because we're all invested in our citations and therefore in producing journal articles, and universities use those to judge and reward researchers. And so, a system of research that's come from a colonial period gets reinforced and amplified by these metrics, by these measurements, by this data, citation data. And as a result, as I don't need to tell you, but there's an awful lot of work that continues to signal how African research and publishing continues to get marginalized. So quick historical pause. When did things fall apart? Well, actually, might have expected that with independence in the 1960s that would have brought new opportunities for African publishers. Well, it didn't, because the university presses like OUP and presses like Heinemann and other commercial presses that had been publishing textbooks in Africa carried on, because they could see there was this huge market as newly independent states needed to expand their educational systems. And so publishers have long subsidized some aspects of what they do with others. So OUP did launch a literary, and Heinemann launched, and Longmans particularly launched literary set publishing initiatives, like the African Writers series, but often that was built on the back of textbook publishing. And this was, kept and tightly controlled by often British and French colonial publishers, which is why it was really hard for African publishers to get started and build an African-focused research economy. Today, well, if we look at someone like Ethiopia here, there are, of course, many journals that have been going very strongly in Ethiopia for many years. And if you look at AJOL, which is an important platform for African journals, it has 61 Ethiopian published journals, many with 2 stars, which is a sort of measure of their quality and their sort of compliance with good practice in publishing. But of those 61, only 6 are indexed and active in Scopus, and only 2 in the Web of Science. So that just signals, in some ways, the sort of the skew between the quality of African journal productivity and visibility in Africa, and then the relative invisibility on a global scale. And if you look at this slide, this is even more sort of shocking, which is the number of Nigerian-based journals that have used to be in Scopus, but no longer. So Scopus obviously is the rival Elsevier-owned citation index that many of you will be familiar with. It's owned by Elsevier and well marketed by them, and a bit more inclusive than the Web of Science. But here too, they've been discontinuing Nigerian journals, and you can see there's the proportion of journals that are no longer included, and then therefore the number of articles that are somehow no longer as visible. And this is probably because on the whole they've not been able to keep up with their regular publication patterns, or because there have been questions around the sort of editorial diversity or authorship diversity. So the citation indexes now have very quite tough threshold data requirements for staying in the indexes. So if I go on now to look at a comparison of 2 journals. One is I'm going to compare here is called Cogent Social Sciences. It's a relatively recent Taylor and Francis mega journal, you might want to call it that, and the other is a journal launched 22 years ago by a Nigerian-based publisher called Adonis and Abbey, and the journal is called African Renaissance. And what's interesting, if you compare these two journals, you see something quite interesting about how an African-focused journal on African studies that has been going for 20 years and publishes, regularly every year, 30 or 40 articles, but it's find it very, very hard to get citations. So if you look at the bottom right-hand picture here, it gets relatively few citations until 2019, when it finally gets indexed in Scopus. Okay, and that's because it's quite hard to get indexed in Scopus. The editor and the publisher has had to work very hard to demonstrate that it meets the sort of quality and citation data requirements of Scopus. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see a journal that's been launched in 2015 by Taylor and Francis at a large scale, publishing many more articles, now 500 articles a year, and rapidly growing its citation as well. And that's partly because the metadata that Taylor and Francis create is much more visible. So it's easier to find these articles on Google Scholar. It's easier to come across them when you're searching, and therefore you're more likely to cite them and find them. And here then is the result. It's a league table with African universities right at the top of the league table. These are the universities across Africa, in South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, where the most authors are publishing in this journal called Cogent Social Science. And as you see, almost quarter, well, rather more than a third of all the articles in this journal are coming from 4 African countries: South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia. They're publishing here because they get a discount, either 50 or 100% APC discount. And what's interesting about this is obviously they're publishing on a range of social sciences. They're publishing in an area, of course, which probably could have been also published in African studies journals, but they're choosing here And so in some ways, this is sucking up, taking papers that might otherwise have been published either in African African sort of owned or run journals, or in more specialist disciplinary journals. Is that a problem? I guess the question might be one of where and how one facilitates a conversation within fields, and whether this massive interdisciplinary journal can ever really be the same as a journal that has a more sort of disciplinary or regional focus. And there are other journals like that as well, from the other publishers. SAGE and Elsevier also have mega journals that also want to attract as many authors as possible. Now, I'm coming to the end here, but I'll just say a little bit about two rather different research ecosystems. Those of you based in UFS will know all too well the culture that the South African research ecosystem has created around publishing, partly through its publication subsidies, and that's built and sustained, a commercial ecosystem in South Africa, but also many South African journals. So you'll also know that there's, relative to many countries, there are a large number of South African journals that are indexed in Scopus, more than almost 100, compared to 60 across the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So there are obviously perverse incentives, consequences for these payments, and this money often goes to institutions. It goes to authors sometimes as well. It doesn't necessarily go to the journals, so it doesn't necessarily allow a model of journal publishing that is sustainable, especially if you're trying to look towards a model which is more community owned, what you might call diamond open access or fee-free open access. And then if you look beyond South Africa, well, across much of the rest of the region, there's relatively little research funding. And so therefore, if you're trying to set up a publishing business, you have to do it either on a shoestring, or rely on very low APCs, or go in with a big major commercial publisher like Brill or Walter Kluwer's. It's very hard to sustain it, and unless your institution is able to back a journal's suite or platform. So you have this real challenge, I think, for building what you might call an Afro structure, and this is the term that Penda Bar uses in this special issue of Global Africa. And she sees an Afro structure as one which has to be supported internally, inclusive, but diverse, recognizing a range of work. It's a great vision, and I think the question that she poses is this going to be possible? Are we going to be able to build an Afro structure? And of course there are a few examples. Adonis and Abbey was a great example, but there aren't many like that. Because can the African commercial publishers compete with Taylor and Francis or De Groote Brill at that scale? And what does it mean then for all of us in terms of where we choose to publish? Will our choices impact on the types of research ecosystem that we build? And I think they will. And that's a hard one, because of course, we can't simply walk away from publishers and journals that we know and respect. And that also relates, of course, to what South African publishers do, because they have strong support, and journals and universities in South Africa attract affiliations and mobility from across the continent. So South Africa also has an interesting question around its relationship to the region. One quick slide on Diamond. There was a big summit in Cape Town in December, calling for much more of a move towards a community-owned open science model, which is a diamond open access ecosystem. This would be where you'd have funding for institutions, so no one pays APCs. It's a great model, but it does require funding, and it doesn't work. You can't publish for free. Journals require money to publish, and so I think all of our challenges, you can't walk away from the dominant grammars and registers, as Daly Murray put it. So we have to work out a way of surviving within this dominant publishing economy, but trying also to change it. One quick page from my.
Can you hear me, David?
Are you speaking to me, Paul, or is that someone else?
Yes, I just want to call your attention to time.
Yeah, no, I'm finishing. That's fine, and it's 12:30. Here. So that's my summary of what I've done, a bit of history, a bit of attention to metadata, the question of outputs, and the question then that I leave you all with is, where do we go next? do we have to choose between visibility and status, or building an infrastructure of publishing? Thank you very much, and thank you, Paul, for chairing, and Samuel, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Quite engaging, I tell you. It's almost like you shouldn't stop, but we are time bound. All right, so we'll call on Samuel Fongwa now, who is training officer, and then for grants and fellowships at Codestra, who will take the next 10 minutes as a discussant of this presentation. Samuel, are you there?
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Let me really first start by thanking you for inviting me to serve as a discussant for David's paper, which is a very interesting and timely paper for us as academics and the work we do. I'll start by also just appreciating the quality of the presentation, the content, as well as the work that ABC and David have been doing for the continent, but also for Codestra over the past. And thanks, David. I will not try to in any way respond to some of the questions, especially to Benderbar's questions, which are very critical in terms of the way forward for us. But I will make 2 or 3 observations. The first observation is I think the paper and the presentation is quite heavy on the output side, which of course is publications. But publications is just as important as the input side, which you made mention to, which is not only the funding, but also the nature of our academic system, the academic culture that we as African academics have taken. So I'll talk around a bit on the input side and how it reflects on the output side, which is the publication. So of course, the first issue which you did mention, David, briefly, is the funding question. Which again, it ties also to the broader debate around globalization and its effect on the African continent. Publishing is just a microcosm of the global forces that we are exposed to within the continent, where markets have been opened, borders have been opened, knowledge has been opened almost, and we are exposed to the market system, which is what we are observing now as fear and the cogent prohibitions. But more interestingly is that while Africa is contributing 1% to global research output, it's only contributing 0.4% of its GDP to research and development. That actually means that we are actually boxing higher than our capacities. Contributing 0.4% of our GDP to research compared to almost 2% of countries in the global north, but actually contributing 1%. So that's something for us to reflect. How do we get across this? Because funding becomes a very important tool in the toolbox in terms of how we move from here. The second point is the academic culture that we have adopted as academics on the continent. And this culture actually promotes global north or Western theories and behaviors and knowledge systems compared to our indigenous knowledge systems, which we are supposed to be promoting. So it almost feels like the game is rigged from the get-go, because we are trying to engage in a language system, knowledge system, for which we have been exposed for 5, 10, 15, 20 years during our master's and PhDs. But we have knowledge systems which we have known for 20, 30, 40 years, which is African indigenous system, knowledge systems, which we are not developing. The question becomes, how do we move towards developing our IKS systems and forms of communicating it and publishing it? That becomes the question. And of course, you actually touched on that quite clearly in that within that academic culture, as you mentioned at the end of your presentation, is the challenge of volume versus recognition. And sometime last year, I was faced with the challenge of some colleagues launched the first African Journal on Community Engagement, University Community Engagement, which is part of the work I am doing. And we were faced with launching a new journal, which is not accredited by the Department of Education and Training. And you see yourself losing out on incentives from the department. But we had to create this journal and publish in this journal for the first 3 years, until which time the department can recognize this journal. And so you get torn between recognition and volume, recognition and relevance, recognition and impact in terms of how we publish. But most often we tend to go for recognition, we tend to go for the benefits of incentives, and we tend to go, of course, with internationally recognized journals. So there is that tension again linked to the academic culture that we have developed, and to some extent which we are incentivizing, just as we mentioned what the Department of Education and Training is doing. And of course, you make mention to the issue of global inequality, which again, it's playing out as a microcosm of a global system. We saw what happened during the COVID-19 vaccination episode, where because of the global inequalities that we face, Africa was left behind or held behind, depending on what we want to see within that health system. And it's also happening in the publishing system, which you have very nicely through the work you have been doing over the years shown out. And it's happening in the ICTs expansion. We are talking about 4IR, 5IR, when some of our countries on the continent have not even gotten to 3IR. We don't have electricity, which was the third industrial revolution. We don't have the basic needs that we need, but we are talking about 4IR and 5IR. So it talks about the global inequality in which we are operating, or in which we are functioning. Again, you really didn't attempt to provide an answer to this question, which is, as the researcher, is understandable. Our work is to raise the issues and put them there and have a conversation around that. But these are some of the input challenges that we have within this output discourse in terms of what comes out on the other side in terms of knowledge and publication. So one thing that you said, which I just made a note, is it will be interesting to get a study of why some of these journals have been discontinued, to get a fuller understanding of the dynamics. Even we at College, sometimes we have the challenges of how regularly we publish, the quality of the publications, and a whole range of issues. To be able to say, of course, there's a challenge, of course, there's inequality, but what are we doing? Again, the input factor, what are we as journalists doing to be able to get our game in order, to be able to meet the demands of this global landscape in which we are. I think that, again, maybe you may want to reflect on that, which I'm sure you're quite versed with. There are other smaller challenges which talks around the small market size. How many Africans or how many scholars are being able to buy or pay for journals? And that challenge we have, again, linked to the issue of funding, that most of our African states do not put as much interest on knowledge or on policies informed by research and knowledge. And so it influences the way the ecosystem of knowledge and research plays out. I think I've spoken for about 8 minutes, and I really want to provide more time for maybe David to respond and for the other colleagues to make some contributions. So I'll give up 2 minutes of my time. Thank you very much, David, for your presentation.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you very much. We will open the floor both for David to respond to Samuel's comments and reflections, and then, of course, from the house and online, we'll be taking questions and comments. So please, David, maybe you have to respond to Samuel's very briefly so that we also have questions from us.
Sure. No, Samuel, that was really excellent, really, really good. You've got all the right sort of points to push me on. You're absolutely right that I was focusing on outputs, and one of the problems with the ways in which now everything gets focused on the end point of research is that somehow we think that we're measuring research because we're counting the number of papers we've written or the number of citations we've got. I mean, this is always the problem. We value what we can count rather than we count what we value. Yeah, and you know that we of course. Research is about the communities we build, about the conversations. It's about doctoral training and education. It's not about the number of papers we have. But in a culture where your promotion depends on you having 24 papers in order to get promoted to associate professor or full professor, as many universities in Ghana have very, very specific numbers, or many universities across Africa, and where they might say you have to have published in only a certain selection of international journals, then the conversation inevitably does become about publishing. So I really agree. You know, we need to change the conversation. And how do we do that? Well, I think that's where our university leadership has to change its incentives, its expectations on us as academics. And how does that change? Well, it's probably by them being less obsessed with global rankings and thinking, okay, what matters to us as a university? And if it's engagement, as you said, I mean, your great initiative, your new journal on community engagement, if the university cares about its engagement with its community, then that should be one of the factors that would give you a promotion. If you cares about teaching, then that's what matters. And you know, if we could escape from some of the ways in which the rankings culture has distorted our research culture, then that would be a really big win, I think, for universities around the world, not just for Africa. But of course, we're talking about Africa here, and it's made much harder, as you say, in a context where there's little money, where we're not acknowledging our own. When, you know, many African knowledge systems are not published about. You publish on work that you're going to get more likely to get published internationally rather than on your own crop systems or your own agricultural or health issues. And yes, you're absolutely right. If you haven't got Wi-Fi and you can't rely on the power supply, how hard is it to get access online? I could talk about the journal discontinuing. It often is, as you know, to do with lack of regularity in publishing. Setting up a journal is hard, or rather, setting up a journal is easy. Keeping it going is hard. You know, it's one thing setting up a journal. It's another thing ensuring a supply of papers. It often is a labor of love for an individual academic who's an editor. You've got to be really committed. It can take a long time to build a journal reputation. And people, you know, in a context where you've got other things to do, you haven't got support for that. It's really hard to do it. It has to be done often in your spare time and your weekends. You raised the question of market size. That was really interesting. You also raised the question around African governments making use of research and evidence. That was really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I'm sure you're right that actually, if there was more demand for evidence-based policy making that was drawing on local knowledge ecosystems, that would really change how and why people would choose to publish. So thank you very much. Great things to think about. I look forward to any other questions and thoughts from everyone.
Okay, thank you. So for any questions in the room, before we come to our online audience, maybe we'll pick a few from the room and then we go to online audience. For our online audience, if you have questions, I can already see someone raising, so you just click the raise hand button and then we will recognize you and take your question. But any question? Okay, let's go for the online. We have two persons online. So the first person I saw was PK. So PK, if you are there, please you go ahead and ask your question.
No, thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you, Prof, for that presentation. I have, I'm not sure if I'll say many questions, but I'll just ask two. Earlier, you spoke briefly about commercial publication. I'm not sure if in this context I can say commercial versus traditional, because I had an instant when I was trying to publish for my master's where a journal house said, nope, we cannot take this paper because it was too commercial, which was strange. And first time hearing about it, I didn't know there are journals that are commercials versus traditional, which was a strange thing for me. So I'm not quite sure what would be your comment there to say, is it a matter of tailor-making a paper to suit, because we tried to tailor-make it to suit the journal publication, but it was just a strange feedback from the editor of that journal. But the second part also, I'm not quite sure if when you ended your perhaps responding now, you spoke of universities indicating that for individuals, especially those who are employed within specific universities, should publish on select publication houses. Is it a matter of policy change or framework change within universities, where a university can say you need to publish on journals that are factor of 1 or greater, which I'm assuming those are very credible and achievable publication, if one can say. But is it not very difficult to publish on those journals that has a factor of 1 and more? So those are just my 2 questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, PK. So yeah, good questions. We all write for journals, don't we? We all have to choose a journal and think about why we're choosing a journal. And the idea would be that you're joining a conversation, ideally. Why the journal you thought of itself as too commercial, thought of your paper as too commercial, I'm not quite sure what they were saying there. I mean, when I say commercial, I mean, these journals, they're often run by academics, and they are, very focused on supporting a field. But they are owned by a commercial publisher, or at least published by a commercial publisher. So there can be pressure on the journal to increase the number of papers being published. It can also make it very hard for a journal to leave a commercial publisher, because the journal might get some money from or the association might get some money from the commercial publisher. So those are the questions for me, which is that these commercial publishers are getting very, very rich on us doing their free editorial peer reviewing. We do a lot of work for free, and yet the publishers get very rich. You asked a question around where we choose to publish. So in South Africa, those of you obviously will know that the Department for Higher Education and Training has a list that updates every year on journals that are accredited, and that's a key list for you all. Many universities use Scopus as their indicative list. Some universities say, in Nigeria, Covenant University says you have to only publish in Q1, which is the sort of journals in the top quartile. So journals set their own expectations around where to publish. And very rarely, if you look at China, for example, by comparison, the universities may require people to publish in Chinese as well as in English or in local journals. That tends not to happen. Occasionally it does, but on the whole, the expectation is international, whatever that means. And the question then is, what counts as an international journal, and that's often up for discussion. So yeah, good thoughts. Thank you, PK.
Let's take one more question online. I saw John. Are you there, John?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, John. Hello.
So very quickly, please.
Okay, good afternoon, Dr. Paul, Michael, Professor David Mills, and distinguished colleagues. John Otoide is my name. I want to thank you, Prof, for this insightful and comprehensive lecture. Please, I want to ask, because I'm a young academic building a future career in this line. And I want to ask, because part of what I'm learning today is that just a percentage of global research comes from Africa. What's the hope for us who want to contribute to global discourse? What platforms, what more can be done for us so that we can actually get the proper orientations in the area of language and reasoning in order to contribute to the global discussion, since we are living in a globalized world? That's my question, Prof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I don't want to suggest it's either global or African. I mean, you want both, don't you? You want a global Africa that enables you to contribute at certain levels to a global conversation, but also that speaks to and comes from issues that speak to what matters within your particular communities or fields or disciplines. So it's not necessarily global versus local, but global and local. And some journals in fields and some editors work really hard at helping people understand the games, the rules of publishing. Okay, if you choose a journal that's been around for a while in a field, they may well offer workshops on writing. They may well give people guidance on how to get published. And a good way of doing that is just reading and seeing what's in a journal and what gets published and why. And when you write for it, then obviously trying to connect to some of those conversations. A lot of publishers do offer guidance on how to get published in a journal, and so it's not. I think it's less of a sort of hidden secret garden than it used to be. I think there is more support for junior researchers. I think we know that your career depends on getting your first papers published, but we don't really teach enough about the publishing economy, and so that for me is something which interests me. Is, you know, as doing a PhD, I didn't really understand it. I don't know, what everyone else thinks, but if you don't understand it, then it's all a bit mysterious. Why are there so many journals? Which journals matter? Why are some journals so highly ranked and so influential? Why do people focus so much on trying to get into journals that will take 2 or 3 years before you can get your paper published because the peer review takes so long? You can see in those contexts why you might choose a journal that can turn it around in a month. What are the implications of doing that? Is there a risk of choosing a journal that will get your paper out quickly but might not be such a high reputation? These are difficult things for all of us, and particularly if you're trying to make a career, and we just don't talk about it enough. And we then resort to sort of scare quotes like predatory publishing, and we create a discourse of fear where you're scared of publishing in the wrong place. You're scared your career might be hit by publishing in somewhere where it's not seen as reputable. And of course, the publishers and the citation index want you to be scared because they want you to stick to their journals. Okay, so it's much harder to go and say, right, well, look, I've set up a new journal at UFS, come and publish in this journal, because it takes a long time to get it to the stage of getting it in the index. So you're forced, if you don't know the journal, to rely on the numbers and on the sort of the established ones, which reinforces their power. So that for me is the challenge here. We've created a sort of cartel that's hard to break and change.
Thank you very much. I hope we have questions from the house here, but okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. Just a quick one. I think I'm not so sure if it's what you said or what I saw on the slide. You talked about competition for African authors. So I just wanted you to clarify on that exactly what you meant.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So on the one hand, I'm saying that historically the journals have made it hard to get into. So those are the elite journals, and then the publishers are recognizing that they can't, in a world where they're competing for market share, they can't support the old model, the traditional model, if you want to call it, of a sort of an elite exclusionary sort of gatekeeping publishing model. So then they have to both keep those old ones, because they can't necessarily tell journals what to do. A publisher supports a journal, but an academic edits it. Occasionally, the publisher will say, look, you should expand your journal because there's so many more papers coming in. And the editors then have to decide whether to go with the publisher or walk away. And there have been a few showdowns like that. But so what publishers have done, very commercially savvy, of course they're very clever, is said, right, well, look, let's keep our elite journals and then we'll cascade papers down that don't get into the elite journals, and we'll expand and create much more inclusive journals which are open access, which somehow retain the papers and get them published. So that's what Taylor and Francis have done. And so the argument I'm trying to make there is that they're quite keen to consolidate Taylor and Francis in particular publishes about 70 African-focused journals, has an office in Cape Town. And obviously, everyone knows the name. It's a globally recognized brand. So they want to keep their authors. They want to attract more authors because the metadata that they get from these published articles is also valuable in itself. if that makes sense. I mean, it's so that's there's this other economy going on here, not just money from the journals and their income from APCs, but also from either marketing the metadata, selling it to universities, in some cases selling it to AI companies to train their AI tools. There's all sorts of ways in which by having more metadata, you actually, and making it more visible, you can create revenue streams from that. So there's an advantage of scale. Yeah. It's a bit like sort of if you control the platform like Amazon, then you make money out of the platform, if that makes sense. So yes, so you have these two or three different economies happening at the same time. You still want to have your exclusionary journals, but you also want to have your inclusive open access journals. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, David. I had a question around language. Recently hosted an early career researchers mentoring workshop that included aspects of writing, and of course they were reflecting on coming from Central and West Africa, so francophone countries, and we also have other countries where Portuguese is the leading language, and this all has to do with colonial legacies. What's your take, I guess, on the issue of language and how it kind of divides Africa's contribution to knowledge and kind of keeps some early career researchers and more advanced academics from contributing to the Anglophone sort of sphere of knowledge?
Yeah, great question. Really important. And the irony of looking at the data from the indexes is that Afrikaans is one of the biggest African languages in terms of publishing journals because of the history of South African publishing compared to any other African language. Obviously, French divides the continent, English and French, such that French authors tend to publish in the French journals, and there's little crossover between them. I think it's a really, really big question around the way in which the dominance of the Anglosphere of English publishing, the assumption that English is the language of global scholarship, has been terribly destructive. And that's why a journal like Global Africa, which is trying to publish every paper in English, French, Arabic, and Swahili, it's those sorts of models that that recognize the importance of multilinguality, of sort of bibliodiversity, of epistemic diversity, feel really important, but they're hard to do. They're expensive. They are sort of hard to make visible. But there are important traditions of Lusophone and Amharic journal publishing and Swahili. So I think if we could get beyond the indexes and their narrowness, then there are great journals that are publishing in all these languages that need to be given more visibility and support. So yeah, I think crucial question for a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks for your presentation. I mean, this conversation really interesting, and it's. I think I don't have a question. It's more a comment in what seems to be a sort of hopeless situation. I mean, how do you get out of this conundrum? And it's a comment based on my experience at the moment of working with on a special issue as a guest editor of Taylor and Francis Journal.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that it's in movie. I mean, I think what's come to my mind to realize is the importance of all role players, because firstly we've got an editor of the journal who's willing to. So the special issue focuses on Global South research by Global South authors, and so it is hard work. It's very hard work because we have been to do quite a lot of developmental work with the authors in getting the papers done. But I think what shocked me most is how hard it's been to find reviewers, and I think that the reviewers, again, you spoke to the problem of people who are volunteering their time, but it's been a real struggle to get people who we know are specialists in the field to respond to our request, just ignore him. And then it takes such a long time to find reviewers, and then you spoke to the time dimension of how long it takes to turn around. And so it just made me think of this sort of ecosystem of we've all got a role to play, because as academics, we need to support the early career researchers, the people who are new to writing, to up the quality of what they send in. Editors can support by way of helping develop that writing and actually giving it the time and the input that is required. Because another thing, some of the reviewers eventually they might agree, but the feedback from the review is so thin that it's very hard to work with. So I think it's just really a statement about the fact that if we're going to go anywhere, everybody has a role to play. And all of us, more than just some editor who must, I mean, I can't imagine how much time it must take for an editor to do this work, but that we can support it behind the scenes with the people that we work with, by helping to review, by adding input to improve the quality of whatever work is being put forward for publication.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I concur with all of that. Sometimes, and the people do make these critiques that the system's broken. Okay, we're all trying to publish too much. We're not actually reading anything. We're just trying to write. Of course, we've got no time to review because how do we benefit from reviewing? We're distorting our practices into something which it doesn't feel the most important thing that we should be doing as academics, which should be sharing and teaching and engaging with our communities. So there's lots and lots wrong. Yeah, and I think that that's sort of the conversation we need to be having is how do we publish less? How do we not set so many sort of unrealistic targets for ourselves? How do we do other things at the same time? And see beyond that publishing ecosystem. So whether that'll happen, whether we can step back, whether the rankings culture will become more open to that. The scary thing I think is when people say, well, let's just use AI to help us do reviewing and of course AI to help us write. So therefore then where are we in all of this? Yeah, I mean it reminds me that actually the best conversations in academic contexts are ones where there is a real conversation, and if a journal can capture that, then that's the most important thing, and then it's worthwhile for everyone involved, isn't it? And if you feel someone's listening and responding, then it's worth carrying on that conversation. So yeah, that's what we should all aim for. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor David Mills, University of Oxford. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate you.
Thank you for the invitation.
We want to thank Samuel Fungwa.
Absolutely, thanks, Sam.
Officer, Training Grants and Fellowship Codestra. Thank you for participating also. I hope you are there, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
And so we also thank our online participants. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much. And of course, we thank everybody today. So we look forward to having you next time at our next edition of the SARChI-HEHD webinar series. For now, we want to call it a day. So bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.